The morning in Atlanta was colder than usual, with a low blanket of gray clouds hanging over the red brick buildings of Magnolia Gardens, draining the color from everything below. Jasmine Brooks stood on the sidewalk with 2 travel bags, an old suitcase, and a cardboard box filled with her son's clothes. Beside her, Malik held tightly to a model of the solar system made from chipped foam balls, trying to keep it from tipping in the wind. The apartment door behind them had just been locked, and the dry metallic click still seemed to echo inside Jasmine's head. The officers carrying out the eviction had given her enough time to collect her medication, a few changes of clothes, and the folder containing her rental records. They were not rude, but they could do nothing except carry out the order written on the page. Jasmine understood that though understanding did nothing to lessen the pain of losing her home. She zipped up Malik's coat, then bent down to adjust the strap of his backpack as though this were just another ordinary morning before school. A local news van pulled up near the entrance. Reporter Elena Ruiz was covering the sharp rise in evictions across the area after 3 families at Magnolia Gardens had been forced out within the same week. When the camera turned toward her, Jasmine started to look away. She did not want Malik to watch his mother become a story of pity on the morning news. But then she glanced at the elderly woman sitting beside her bags at the far end of the sidewalk and at a young father trying to call a temporary shelter for his 2 children. Jasmine stopped. "I'm not asking to live here for free," she said, her voice steady even as her hands tightened around the folder. "I paid my share. The rest of the assistance was approved. I just want them to keep their word." At that same moment, in a business-class airport lounge hundreds of miles from Atlanta, Evan Caldwell looked up from his phone when he heard those words coming from the large television screen. His gaze settled on the boy holding the science model, then shifted to the red brick facade behind the reporter. As the camera moved across the entrance gate, the number 1747 came clearly into view. Evan shot to his feet. He recognized the address. Magnolia Gardens was the first building he had ever purchased, and it still belonged to his company. 4 days before the eviction, Jasmine Brooks woke up at 5:15. The apartment was still dark, and the kitchen light fell across the lunchbox she was preparing for Malik. She toasted bread, checked her son's homework, then changed into her light blue uniform. Every movement was familiar, as if keeping life on schedule could stop trouble from entering their home. Jasmine had once worked full hours every week, but the rehabilitation center lost a major contract and her shifts were cut by nearly 1/3. At the same time, the transmission in her old sedan failed, forcing her to use money meant for bills to repair the car. After calculating everything again, she was still $420 short on the rent. She applied for emergency assistance from the county, paid the amount she had then called the management office. An employee confirmed that her file had been noted and that the eviction would be placed on hold while they waited for the money. 2 days later, an email from the county said the assistance had been approved. Jasmine read the words again and again, then let out a quiet breath. But the Magnolia Gardens payment portal still had her account locked and new fees continued to appear. That evening, Malik handed his mother an invitation to his science competition. Jasmine promised she would sit in the front row. After he fell asleep, she stepped into the hallway and saw a white envelope taped beside the door. Inside was not a payment reminder. It was an order requiring her to leave the apartment the next morning. The next morning, Jasmine called the management office. After 40 minutes on hold, she was only told that her file had been transferred to the legal department. The company had obtained a default judgment because she had failed to appear at the hearing. Jasmine froze. She had never known there was a hearing. She searched through her email but could not find a summons. Later, she learned that the notice had been sent to an old address she had not used in more than 2 years. On paper, the process appeared legal. In real life, she was about to lose her home without ever having the chance to defend herself. When the officers arrived to carry out the eviction, they gave Jasmine a few minutes to gather her medication and clothes. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Malik stand motionless beside his bedroom door. Marcus Hill, the maintenance manager, quietly helped him carry the science model down the stairs. Ayn had known the family for 6 years and had never seen Jasmine avoid a bill. In the office downstairs, Marcus saw an internal file still open on the screen. The county assistants had not been rejected by the system. Someone with management authority had manually blocked it just hours before the eviction order was carried out. Keisha Turner called the television station. When the cameras arrived, Jasmine intended to stay out of sight, but when she saw two other families standing beside their luggage, she changed her mind. If she remained silent, this would not stop with her apartment. Right there in the airport lounge, Evan Caldwell called the company's chief operating officer. The person on the other end quickly explained that Jasmine Brooks had failed to pay the full amount of rent, had not appeared at the hearing, and that the eviction had been carried out according to proper procedure. Evan listened to everything, then told them to open the original file instead of reading from a summarized report. Only a few minutes later, a provision appeared on his computer screen. The Financial Hardship Assistance Policy Evan had signed years earlier clearly stated that no tenant could be evicted when government assistance had been approved or was still awaiting disbursement. Jasmine met both conditions. Evan immediately ordered a 72-hour suspension of all evictions in the region and sent an independent legal team to Atlanta. But by the time the order reached Magnolia Gardens, Jasmine and Malik had already left. The mother and son rented a small room near the highway. The carpet smelled damp, the door latch was loose, and the nightly rate was almost equal to what Jasmine normally spent on groceries for an entire week. Malik placed his science model on the table beside the window and asked his mother when they could go home. Jasmine did not know how to answer. That afternoon, a communications representative from Caldwell Residential offered to move them to a better hotel and cover all expenses on the condition that Jasmine appear in a statement saying the matter had been resolved. She refused. A nicer room does not erase the eviction record under my name. When Evan asked to meet with her privately, Jasmine agreed only if her lawyer and a representative of the other families were also present. This time, Evan understood that he could not correct the wrong with a check and an apology. Evan arrived in Atlanta late that afternoon without an entourage or cameras. He entered the conference room believing that an apology and compensation might bring the matter to a close. But Denise Warren Jasmine's attorney placed a stack of documents on the table that was thicker than he had expected. Over the previous 18 months, rent at Magnolia Gardens had increased by nearly 35%. Many longtime residents had been charged unusual fees, lost parts of their payment histories, or been denied assistance even after their applications had been approved. Sitting across from Evan, Jasmine presented rent receipts emails from the county, screenshots of the locked payment portal, and a 6-year record showing that she had never paid late. Finally, she played the recording confirming that the eviction would be placed on hold. When the recording ended, Evan understood that this was no longer an administrative error. He offered to restore her apartment. Jasmine calmly said she would return only after the eviction record was erased. The locks were changed, and every promise was put in writing. She also demanded that the cases of 6 other families be reviewed. For the first time, Evan's power could not shorten the truth. As everyone prepared to leave, Marcus Hill stood in the hallway gripping his maintenance cap tightly in his hands. He pulled Denise aside and said he could prove that the evictions had been planned. But if he turned over those emails, he could lose the job that had supported his family for 22 years. Marcus took one night to make his decision. The next morning, he met Denise at a diner near Magnolia Gardens and placed a flash drive containing the saved emails on the table. They showed that Martin Vale had instructed employees to reject assistance payments that arrived after an internal deadline, even when the county had already approved the funds. Vacant apartments would be renovated and rented out again at higher prices while bonuses were tied to the unit turnover rate. One email left Denise silent. Martin had written that tenants facing financial hardship no longer fit the property's new positioning. There was no openly discriminatory language, but the people most affected were still working families, elderly residents, and single mothers. When Evan confronted him, Martin did not deny it. He said the company was about to undergo a financial review. If profits did not increase, investors might pull their funding, and employees would lose their jobs. In Martin's mind, he was only protecting the business. Evan asked, What kind of company are we protecting if we have to break our promises to keep it alive? That afternoon, Martin discovered that Marcus had copied the records. He immediately suspended Marcus for violating internal data policies and warned that legal action might follow. Marcus sat alone in the workshop staring at the family photograph beside his toolbox. For the first time, he wondered whether he had done the right thing or had only cost his family its source of income. Just one day later, a copy of Jasmine's rental record appeared in the local newspaper showing that she still owed money at the time the eviction order was issued. Martin did not speak publicly, but the information was enough to change the direction of the story. On social media, many people began calling Jasmine someone who was exploiting sympathy to live for free. Malik read those comments on a classmate's phone. That evening, he sat quietly on the edge of the bed in the motel room and asked his mother whether they could move to another city where no one knew their names. Jasmine nearly agreed. She was exhausted from having every bill, every mistake, and every vulnerable moment in her life placed under judgment. But Denise reminded her that Martin was trying to reduce a systemic problem to a story about the character of one mother. At the emergency hearing before the City Housing Board, Martin argued that the company had followed the law and that Jasmine had failed to meet her financial obligations. When it was her turn, she did not become angry. Jasmine placed each document on the table and clearly stated the date of payment, the date the assistance was approved, the promise to place the eviction on hold, and the time the funds were rejected. Then, Denise played the recording of the call. The room fell silent. Marcus entered from the back of the hearing room. Although he was still suspended, he confirmed that employees had been instructed to block valid payments. Evan stood last. He looked toward Jasmine and said that although he had not personally signed the eviction order, the final responsibility still belonged to the owner of the company who had allowed that system to exist. The next morning, Evan Caldwell returned to the microphone with a set of documents the legal department had revised overnight. He announced that Jasmine's eviction record would be canceled and completely erased. Every case from the previous 18 months would be reviewed, improper fees and moving expenses would be reimbursed, and her lease would be restored at the previous rate. Martin Vale was suspended pending the investigation, and an independent firm would audit the entire management process. Evan then offered Jasmine 1 year of free rent. The entire room fell silent as if everyone were waiting for her to accept a ready-made happy ending. Jasmine looked at Malik and refused. She did not want a large gift to turn this struggle into a story about a billionaire's generosity. What she needed was protection that other families could use as well. She asked the company to establish an appeal process before any eviction, appoint an independent tenant representative, and promised not to retaliate against employees who reported wrongdoing in good faith. Evan agreed to put all 3 protections in writing. Marcus was reinstated and later transferred to the Quality Control Department. Martin was not publicly humiliated. The results of the investigation would determine his responsibility. That afternoon, Jasmine and Malik returned to Magnolia Gardens. Their neighbors helped them carry their belongings up the stairs. When the apartment door opened, Malik saw his science model sitting intact on the table. Marcus had kept it safe in the workshop, waiting for the day the boy could bring it home. The weeks that followed did not turn Jasmine's life into a fairy tale. She still woke before sunrise, put on her light blue uniform, and drove the old sedan that rattled whenever she turned. In the evenings, after checking Malik's homework, she opened her nursing textbook on the same table that had once been covered with eviction notices. Malik had not forgotten the morning the door was locked. Whenever he heard a knock in the hallway, he still froze. But something important had changed. Jasmine's eviction record was completely erased, so the company's wrongdoing would no longer follow her when she applied for jobs or rented another home. Caldwell Residential created a resident council with representatives elected by the tenants. Evan asked Jasmine to join and offered to compensate her for her time. She signed only after Denise reviewed the contract and made sure Jasmine had the right to question the company without being forced into silence. The additional income helped Jasmine continue her practical nursing program. Evan also changed the way he reviewed the monthly reports. Along with profits and occupancy rates, he required data on complaints, the number of families receiving assistance, and how their cases were resolved. The audit confirmed that Martin had deliberately falsified the data, and he was fired. There was no public humiliation. More importantly, the system that had once allowed those decisions to exist was changed one procedure at a time. 1 year later, the old laundry room on the ground floor of Magnolia Gardens had been transformed into a bright space with rows of computers, legal filing cabinets, and a study corner for children. The walls displayed a schedule for free consultations, instructions for applying for rental assistance, and an emergency phone number for families at risk of losing their homes. Evan had once suggested naming the space after one of the company's foundations, but the residents refused. They simply called it the Magnolia Room because it belonged to the entire community. On opening day, Malik stood in front of a long table, carefully adjusting the solar system model that had nearly been left behind during the eviction. That project had helped him win second place in his school's science competition. Jasmine stood nearby in her nurse trainee uniform, her face still carrying the fatigue of someone balancing work, school, and motherhood at the same time, but her eyes were different. She no longer looked toward the door whenever she heard footsteps in the hallway. Marcus and Denise sat in the front row. Evan stood in the back without a separate podium and without allowing the company logo to appear on the wall. When Jasmine stepped forward, the room gradually fell silent. "There was a time when I thought my family needed someone powerful to come and save us," she said. "But what we truly needed was a system that knew how to listen before someone's life was torn apart." She looked toward the people who had stood beside her, then said that no one makes it through a crisis entirely alone. The best kind of help does not make the person receiving it feel small or indebted. It gives them back their voice, their choices, and the chance to move forward on their own. When the ceremony ended, Jasmine and Malik walked down the hallway beneath the warm yellow lights. At their apartment, she took the key from her pocket and opened the door. 1 year earlier, that door had been locked in front of the two of them. Now she opened it with her own hand. And that was the lesson that remained after everything. Justice is not only about correcting a wrong that has already happened. True justice means changing the conditions that allowed the wrong to happen, so the next person does not have to endure the same pain.